does DNA know how to make proteins? How does a seed become a flower if it doesn't have a brain? If complex behaviors of this kind can emerge from simple rules, seemingly without external direction, could the same kind of undirected process have produced life itself? Profound as these questions are, the implications of the new science of emergence don't stop there. Can emergence help us to understand and predict human behavior when people operate en masse the way ants and birds do? Can it explain how an aggregate of unintelligent cells work together to produce one of the greatest mysteries of science and philosophy, human consciousness? If the components of the brain achieved consciousness in this way, could an aggregate of computer components do the same thing? That last idea might seem far-fetched, but so did the idea that a computer might be able to learn on its own before such programs were invented. Yes, artificial intelligence is already here. There are computer programs that can learn, as we'll discover later in this lecture. This leap from a computer that is supplied with all of its information to one that can figure things out on its own represents a major paradigm shift and reflects one of the most revolutionary applications of emergence. We started our tour of scientific concepts by posing the question of what life's meaning is. And in many ways, the study of emergence reformulates the question in a new and startling way. The study of emergence advances our knowledge by helping us find the rules that exploit recurring patterns or regularities in a complex system. Not all solutions are created equal, and most possibilities are irrelevant or undesirable. But those that recur and lead to a strategy for solving a higher level problem, like how to optimize a neighborhood for its residents or keep an ant colony alive, are what we call emergent. And the rules of emergence can't be unearthed simply by summing up the rules that apply to the individual agents in a system. Emergent properties are something above and beyond that, and depend on the interaction of constituent parts in ways that are still unclear. Frankly, emergence as a discipline doesn't present hypotheses that can be easily tested. Much of the work in the field relies on naive observation, and as such, its scientific rigor can be questionable. But as the field finds its footing, it poses many of the most interesting and important questions that we can ask. In the 1960s, as computer science was in its infancy, a Midwesterner named John Holland was obsessed with the problem of how complex behavior can emerge from simple rules. Having just obtained the first Ph.D. in computer science from the University of Michigan, he set out to develop a computer program that was capable of learning. At the time, the best-known scientific theory of how order can emerge from chaos was evolution, specifically the mechanism of natural selection. And so Holland borrowed from the ideas of Darwin to pioneer a type of computer program called a genetic algorithm. Genetic algorithms are a type of shortcut or heuristic that uses the principles of natural selection to optimize searches. You can think about learning as essentially a search process. There's a problem and you need to find a solution. Once you do, you've learned something, that your problem can be solved with the solution that you just found. For example, let's say that I want to learn how to navigate through a maze. Well, first I try one direction and then another, until eventually I find a path that takes me to where I need to be. I've solved the maze and learned to navigate it so that the next time I can just take that one path. Genetic algorithms work in a similar way, except that natural selection is applied by specifying the population of potential solutions, all the different ways of going through the maze, in my example, and then over many trials or iterations, the best solution wins or outlasts all the suboptimal ones. Survival of the fittest, you might say. Every genetic algorithm has at least two components: a representation of the environment in which the solution will be found, and a fitness function to evaluate the solutions. Each potential solution has a particular set of properties akin to its genetic code that can undergo mutations. And the algorithm works by creating multiple generations of these solutions whose fitness or solution strength is then evaluated. The algorithm stops when either a preset number of generations have been created or a solution that reaches a target fitness level is found. What's interesting about these algorithms is that in the successful ones, the solutions that are generated in the later generations are qualitatively different from the potential solutions suggested to begin with. The information evolves. Something better comes from simple inputs. The computer learns. Genetic algorithms, or GAs, are now used to find all kinds of different solutions to difficult problems in fields as diverse as space engineering, bioinformatics, manufacturing, chemistry, and even neuroscience. I last used a GA when I needed to optimize the order and timing of trials in a brain scanning study. And it proved to be a much more effective way of organizing the trials than any other system I had previously thought of. Shortly after Holland showed the world how useful genetic algorithms might be, computer scientists David Jefferson and Chuck Taylor at UCLA designed a program that utilized the principles of GAs to simulate how ants might forage for food. This was in the 1980s, when biologist E.O. Wilson had just published his famous treatise on the social behavior of ants. Jefferson and Taylor wanted to see if they could use the rules of ant foraging to create a genetic algorithm that would optimize ant foraging behavior and mimic the way ants behave in the real world. The rules they gave to their computer simulation were that the virtual ants had to follow a pheromone trail on a checkerboard of squares. But it was a crooked path with distractions and breaks and many twists and turns. And the pheromones were time sensitive. Their scent degraded with time. Then they added the fitness function. Ants that lost the path of the pheromone after only one square would only score a 1, whereas ants that made it to the end, the 82nd square, would score an 82. Then only the virtual ants that performed sufficiently well were allowed to mate and have offspring. But they didn't tell the virtual ants how to solve the problem. They just left them to trial and error, and the algorithm dictated who would reproduce and who wouldn't. The two scientists had no idea how many generations it would take for the simulation to get a perfect score. That is, for all of the ants to make it to the end. They figured it might be 10,000 or possibly never. But in a mere 100 generations, they had a perfect population of virtual ants. Their computer had figured out the best solution and had improved with time. It had learned. When they looked more closely at the solution, they found that some of their best trackers had evolved adaptations to their particular environment. Put simply, they had begun to favor one type of trail or pattern of turns over others. The trail that they had set on the checkerboard started with 3 right turns, and the ant that had solved it showed a learning preference for making right turns. It had adapted. All of a sudden, the line between real and virtual world learning had begun to blur. These adaptations were not programmed into the software, but they emerged from the rules that were set out. The program improved without the direct involvement of the programmers, simply because of the way that the algorithm was set up. If virtual ants can learn and evolve, what makes real ants different? And if a computer can learn, what does that say about us? Nowadays, genetic algorithms and other computer programs can perform many feats that our own brains are simply incapable of. But there are still 1 or 2 things that we're pretty good at, even at a young age, that machines have found simply too taxing. One of these things is sentience, understanding or believing that we are conscious. For most of us, consciousness is still the most important thing that separates us from artificial life. A computer, no matter how well it might be able to solve problems, still can't feel pain, right? And isn't feeling pain or being self-aware in some other way the essential component of human life? But what makes us self-aware when computers, who can outperform us in so many ways, aren't? Each one of our bodies is made up of fairly simple cells, all acting with simple rules to follow, many of which are written into our genetic code. None of the individual cells can think or make high-level decisions, and out of that chaotic cacophony, our complex natures emerge. We're capable of so much more than the sum of our parts, or so it seems at least. Despite the fact that none of our neurons can think on its own, we experience our minds as integrated, and we have a bizarre self-awareness. We can introspect or observe at least some small part of our thinking. Now, it turns out that we're far less aware than we think of the computations that our brains make that lead to our decisions and ultimately affect our behavior. But there is something to this consciousness thing. How on earth might it have emerged from this tangled mass of relatively stupid cells? What can the principles of emergence teach us about our own consciousness? We've talked quite a bit about the binary nature of our brain cells in this course. They can either fire an action potential and propagate a signal or not. Ones and zeros, on or off. Neurotransmitters are the pheromones of neurons. They can influence the behavior of individual cells, and they have information in terms of their presence or absence and in terms of their gradient, how much of each type are floating around the synapses at any given time. Just like ants, different neurons have different functions. Some translate information from the senses into electrical signals, as in the eyes and the inner ear. Some pass information along from peripheral body parts. Some inhibit firing in the hippocampus to prevent seizures. Some tick like clocks, keeping your body aware of the time of day. Many of these neurons have jobs assigned from birth, though, as we've seen in the neuroplasticity lectures, they can make some changes as their circumstances change with age, injury, or training. And some neurons are specifically involved in helping you understand the intentions and beliefs of people and animals around you. These latter neurons were first discovered by a group of Italian neuroscientists headed by a man named Giacomo Rizzolatti. They were interested in the brain cells that are involved in motor actions, like grasping a cup or eating a banana. So they started recording firing patterns or electrical signals from neurons in monkeys while the monkeys were performing these tasks. They found cells that would fire when the monkeys were engaged in a specific task, grasping a cup or eating a banana. But then, they also found that those same cells sometimes fired when the monkey was watching somebody else perform that task. They called these cells mirror neurons because they seemed to be mirroring what they were seeing. The same cells that would be firing if the monkey picked up a banana fired when he saw another monkey pick up a banana. Now, there's nothing special about these neurons in terms of their shape or type or size or any other distinguishing feature. The only thing that makes them mirror neurons is what they seem to respond to, what stimulates them. And these mirror neurons make up about 10% of the neurons in the parts of the monkey's brain where they're normally found. And they've also been found in humans. In fact, the lab where I was a grad student at UCLA was the first to publish direct recordings from mirror neurons in humans. So what are the implications of mirror neurons in humans and monkeys, for that matter? Well, mirror neurons seem to perhaps play a role in how we understand the intentions of others, how we develop what's called a theory of mind, or the idea that other people have thoughts, desires, and goals just like we do. We're at the forefront of neuroscience here, so the ground is a little shaky. But even if these particular cells ultimately aren't the neural basis of theory of mind, they provide a good case study for how sentience and self-awareness might emerge from simple cells. Note that no single mirror neuron or other neuron is actually conscious. No single cell knows that another being has intentions. Instead, the information that these cells carry can help the colony, or the brain, extract another person's intentions. It's an emergent property. How might this work? Well, individual mirror neurons might provide the information that a monkey or baby or any one of us needs to figure out how to mimic or mirror an action that we see someone else perform. When we mimic that action, we put ourselves in the other person's shoes, and we begin to discover what it might be like to be that person. These neurons and the system that reads their information seem to be involved in the development of theory of mind. If you give a 3-year-old a box of chocolates filled with crayons instead of candies, the child will be sorely disappointed. Then, if you bring an adult into the room or another child and ask the first child what that person who hasn't seen the box before will think is in it, that first 3-year-old will insist that the person will think that there are crayons in the box. But a 4-year-old knows better. She'll tell you that the new person will think it's candy, just like she did, because that person doesn't know that the box is a fake. The child has learned that the other person has a mind just like hers, unless the child is autistic. It's this system that is awry in children with autism. They have trouble learning that others also have minds and beliefs and intentions and desires. So, how did this ability to consider the minds of others come about? We don't know the full answer yet, but some clues can be found in the ways in which we've evolved to live in social groups. Social interactions can extend your lifespan, just as the lack of social support can hasten death. The vast majority of humans live in extended groups, most of us with complex social systems. And this trait makes us unique among apes. Only chimpanzees live in mixed-sex social groups like we do. We benefit from coming together to solve problems, build shelter, gather, grow and hunt food, and help each other raise children. But with larger social groups also comes the challenge of keeping the peace and making sure that your needs are met. We had to sort out that we each have our own minds so that we can navigate this precarious social swamp. Some psychologists go so far as to suggest that the exponential increase in the ratio of brain to body size that characterizes our species emerged as a result of our living in groups. The social brain hypothesis suggests that we evolved into our intelligent selves not in response to ecological problems, but so that we can all get along. The idea is that theory of mind was selected for as we began to live in groups. If that's true, then those neurons that aid us in forming our own mental picture of the thoughts and intentions of others might represent the building blocks of self-awareness. If we learn that others have a mind, can we not turn those same cells inward and observe our own mind? Social complexity possibly led to the explosion in brain size by simply increasing the number of computations that we need to make in order to understand multiple other minds. If there's a module in the brain that is made up of cells like mirror neurons or some similar equivalent, and it works fairly well at analyzing one person's mind, maybe understanding many people's minds simply means adding more modules. At some point, however, we reached a limit. It turns out that most of us have a social circle that caps out at about 150 people. This is called Dunbar's number, after Robin Dunbar, who first proposed the social brain hypothesis. To find this number, he looked at the correlation between primate neocortex size and the size of the social group in which the primates are most likely to live. The neocortex is so named because it's evolutionarily speaking the newest part of our brains, the most recent part to evolve. And we have more of it than our related counterparts in the primate world. The larger the social group, it turns out, the bigger the neocortex, and that includes mirror neurons. On average, For example, out of all of the primates, we have the largest neocortex to brain size ratio, and we live in the largest social groups. Next come the chimpanzees and bonobos, who also have a relatively high ratio and also live in social groups, although their networks are slightly smaller than ours. Then other primates, particularly more solitary ones, have even smaller ratios. The number 150 seems to represent the upper limit of people with whom we can maintain stable relationships, not the total number of people that we know or the number of people in your Facebook friends. Some other anthropologists have come up with larger numbers, but the idea that there is a limit is fairly well accepted. But as a civilization, we've managed to overcome this limitation of our brains. Not by continuing to increase neocortex size, since it's hard enough to get those big heads through the birth canal, but by linking up brains into larger networks. In our day, those networks have begun to expand dramatically. The question is, what, if anything, is emerging from these growing aggregations of humanity? There came a time, likely about the time when we figured out how to domesticate animals and grow plants, that we started to gather in groups that were larger than 150 people. We started to live in cities with tens of thousands of individuals and individual minds to keep track of. And our poor neurons simply couldn't keep up. So a new level of organization had to emerge. Instead of neurons being the building blocks or the ants in the colony, we ourselves became the simplest units. We started living in neighborhoods, and now our colony size exploded. Think about how this is happening in your own life. No matter where you live, your neighborhood, your town, your city has a personality. Traits that separate it from other places to live and have emerged as distinct. I live in San Francisco, with its largely liberal culture, its beautiful landscape, its steep hills, and its propensity to support artists and bohemians. But I also live in a specific neighborhood, and I've watched it change over the last few years. When we moved in, it was all we could afford. So as a young married couple, we didn't mind the grit and the fast food restaurants and the relatively high crime rate. But we weren't alone. Lots of young professional couples had the same idea. Now, we didn't plan it. None of us got together and decided that we would all move to the neighborhood and try to make it better. But slowly, things have changed. A hip new coffee shop run by another young couple opened up, and suddenly more people were hanging out in the streets, talking to each other and sharing resources. The success of the coffee shop encouraged an upscale restaurant to try its luck, and we all decided to patronize it on our own special occasions. Then another restaurant saw the opportunity, and soon people from better neighborhoods began coming to ours for dinner. Another coffee shop, and suddenly we started to bump into each other more often, exchanging greetings and ideas. Someone suggested that we try to get a farmer's market to open on Sunday mornings. Within weeks, it was a thriving place to grab produce and a treat. Over the past few years, the fast food restaurants have been replaced by nicer places. Crime has gone down since there are so many people out on the streets that might witness it. Miniature parks called parklets have popped up as merchants seek to keep their locals wandering by their stores. Suddenly, in just a few years, my husband and I live in a hip part of town. This improvement in our neighborhood emerged because we each had our own small but not insignificant role to play. And yet, if a planning commission had set out to make these improvements, it's highly unlikely that they would have succeeded as thoroughly or as quickly. And certainly, no one planned the single most important event in San Francisco's history, the gold rush. Around 1849, the year that gave our football team its name, the city went from housing 200 people to hosting more than 30,000. In response, California became a state in 1850. Roads, schools, churches were quickly built. Towns and cities were chartered. Large-scale agriculture began. By 1870, the population of San Francisco had ballooned to 150,000. And to this day, the pioneering, civic-minded spirit characterizes San Francisco's 800,000 odd residents. These features, along with many others, emerged as a result of the circumstances of San Francisco's boom, but have been maintained even as our daily lives have drastically changed. The gold in the hills is now the silicon in the valley. One of the more obvious emergent structures in our city is the recent increase in dedicated bike lanes. As our city dwellers decided that biking is a desirable form of travel, they have carved out common bike paths along certain routes. Many of these routes are not obvious to the uninitiated, as we often see poor tourists trying to bike up really steep hills when they could easily have avoided them. And as more bikers have chosen a specific path, the increased accident rate along those corridors has forced city planners to dedicate bike lanes and rearrange vehicular traffic. Now, no one planned out a series of bike routes. These have simply emerged along with the bike culture. In fact, on certain Fridays during rush hour, thousands of bicyclists participate in a ride from the financial district to the neighborhoods called the critical mass. The ride is designed to assert the rights of bicyclists and take back the streets at a most inconvenient time for people who commute by car. So the bicycling ants have forced the colony of San Francisco to create an intricate and extensive series of connected bike paths. A new structure emerges out of chaos, changing the way the city moves. But we're not ants, you might be thinking. Ants are robotic in many ways. They don't choose for themselves. They don't change their minds. We do. So a system in which thinking humans are the agents doesn't follow the rules of emergence. It's not predictable. Well, some neuroscientists have argued that free will, or our ability to really choose our actions, is nothing but an illusion. I'm not one of those. But even so, there's a lot of evidence demonstrating that if you put enough people into an aggregate, they will begin to behave in predictable ways. Like in traffic. We can all choose to veer off the side of the road or stop for no reason, but we don't. At least the vast majority of us don't. So an understanding of complex systems made up of many, many humans, like the critical mass bike ride or the stock market or the rise of the internet and social networking, can benefit from the study of their rules and emergent properties. You might have noticed that many of the complex questions that emergence poses and seeks to answer have no sharply defined boundaries. When do neurons become a brain? How many residents make a neighborhood? Does one new bike path warrant the label of an emergent structure? 2? 3? The same blurry edges characterize many of the questions that we've explored in this course. What is life? How much of us is genes versus environment? Where is the line between the macro and the nanoscopic worlds? What is gravity? Have we found the smallest particles yet? What is energy? Science can't yet provide perfect definitions for many of the big topics that fascinate us, but we can set the boundaries for the purpose of an experiment and discover an answer to a specific question. If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? The answer depends on how we define sound. We can say that sound is a perception, that the boundary is in our cochlea, where the disturbances in the air are translated into electrical signals. So, if there's no cochlea to make that transfer, there's no sound. But we can also define sound as the pattern of vibrations in the air caused by the falling tree. In that case, the tree makes a sound whether or not there is an observer to hear it. Both definitions are valid and tell us something about the nature of sound and hearing. That's not as satisfying as a definitive answer, perhaps, but the open-endedness of the problem, like the search for the meaning of life, has its own benefit. It drives us onward. If a question is well posed, the answer will lead to a better, more interesting question. Science doesn't reduce. It expands our wonder, and it feeds our imagination. I hope that this course has done just that for you. Instead of quenching your curiosity, I hope that I have sparked it. There's so much more to explore.